Okay, so last time we had talked about the nation states arranging in the 19th century, what France, Great Britain, and Germany now looked like, along with some of the artistic and scientific accomplishments that gave people the 19th century a certain sort of specific outlook on life. And now, as we wrap up the 19th century here, we're going to just think of that outlook they have on life as we think about the events that are immediately preceding World War I, which is how we'll start the next unit. So, often called Africa's undoing, the Berlin Conference saw the powers of Europe divide the African continent like young boys dividing up baseball cards. And with little to no concern for the culture of the continent, maps were redrawn, lands were claimed, and as Europe bickered over who got what, the native inhabitants of Africa watched as their culture was uprooted and destroyed. All for two main reasons that we discussed yesterday: the white man's burden, the idea that whites were superior, were better fit in an evolutionary sense to provide culture and take care of what Rudyard Kipling called the half devil, half child of the wild people of Africa and Asia, basically non-white, non-European. And the second reason, industrialization and the need for raw resources to fuel the industrial giants of these modern European nation states. So before we dive into the details of the conference that divides up these areas between these nation states, let's take a look at the years leading up to it. When Henry Morton Stanley explored the Congo region, Europe's interest in the continent swelled. In the 1870s, organizations like the International African Society and the International Congo Society were formed by Europeans to research and civilize the continent. You might be familiar with Henry Morton Stanley. He was a PhD professor. He went out to explore the dark continent because much of its interior was not even known. And he wasn't seen for like 3 years. And an intrepid newspaper reporter by the name of Livingston went out as part of a story he wanted to write to find what happened to Stanley. And he comes across this tribe of all Africans, and of course one white guy working with him, and he walks up and famously says, Dr. Stanley, I presume. There's this great mythology behind that, and it makes it romantic, exploring Africa, living there. Think of the Tarzan series. So of course it doesn't take long for researching and civilizing to turn into claiming and conquering as countries like France, Britain, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal scrambled to grab up these new lands that were being found. And this scramble of sorts was the impetus for the mid-1880s Berlin Conference, where over a dozen European countries met to discuss the colonization of Africa. Now, what did Africa look like prior to this conference? Well, in order to grasp the impact of the conference, we do need to understand that prior to the conference, a large portion of Africa was still under local control. That is to say, native inhabitants of Africa were still ruling their own people groups. Also, at the time of the conference, European colonization focused mainly on the coast of the continent. Africa's interior remained virtually untouched by outsiders, hence the name the Dark Continent. Ignoring these ancient cultural lines and people groups, the participants of the Berlin Conference spent about 3 months devising guidelines for colonization of not just Africa's coast, but the interior as well. Now, to make trade easier for everyone, the conference decided the Congo and Niger rivers would remain neutral and open to all participants. Beyond this, the conference declared Europeans were free to aggressively colonize Africa. And to make trade easier for everyone, I already said that, but making matters even worse for the Africans, it also established a principle known as the principle of effectivity, which made it acceptable for one European nation to claim jump another European nation's African claims if they were not fully exploiting the land. In other words, the Berlin Conference pretty much told Europe they couldn't establish a colony in name only. They had to use it or lose it. So as you can imagine, this allowed abuses to abound across the continent. For one, what does, the word I'm looking for, what does exploiting the land mean? Does that also mean the people? In other words, if I'm not push the populace into labor to extract these resources, how much resources do I have to extract yearly? So there's lots of room for interpretation on this. So your best bet as a nation is to go all out. So as you can imagine, this allowed abuses to abound across the continent. In fact, within years of the conference, it's estimated that over half of the Congo Basin's native population had died. The years following the conference held further chaos for the continent and its people. By the early 20th century, Europe had cut Africa up into dozens of new countries. Great Britain held places like Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, Egypt, the Sudan, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and more, while France controlled much of Western Africa. Belgium controlled the Congo, and Germany took places like Tanzania and Namibia. Not to be left out, the Portuguese, the Italians, and the Spanish also got their share. Sadly, and this is the same thing that happened in the Middle East, as we'll see in the next unit, the boundaries of all these new countries have little respect for the culture or the long-established boundaries of the native people groups. So Africa is being devastated because of the industrialization of these big nations. But you'll notice there's some big nations that were left out of the Berlin Conference that now don't have access to resources but want desperately to maintain their power and be industrialized. And that brings us to Russia and the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. And they go to war over these natural resources, particularly because of Russia's desire for a warm water port, which has been the constant historic theme of Russia since Ivan the Terrible. So they end up going to war. The Russo-Turkish War of the late 19th century signaled a turning point in Europe's balance of power. It pitted Russia against the once powerful Muslim Turks of the Ottoman Empire, and this conflict ushered in sweeping change. For Russia, these changes would eventually work out rather well. For the Ottomans, not so much. This was the beginning of the end for their empire. To begin, for much of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Ottoman Empire and the Russians had been at odds. And the Russians greatly coveted the Turkish control of the Black Sea ports and its trade routes to the Mediterranean Sea. Of course, the Turks had no interest in relinquishing this control. Making things harder for Russia, the rest of Europe, especially Britain and France, had no intentions of letting Russia control these trade routes and become a competition to them. So this was clear due to the Crimean War of the 1850s, which we already discussed, in which these two European powerhouses came to the aid of the Ottomans. So although the Crimean War was officially won by the Ottomans and their European allies, what ensued were years of on-again, off-again fighting as Russia pushed further and further into Ottoman lands, gaining control of parts of the Black Sea. Now, despite the desire for most of Europe, Russia continued to move into Ottoman lands. And unfortunately for the Ottomans, this claim came to a decisive head in the Balkans. The Balkans are a mountainous region north of Greece that includes lots of, the Czech Republic, Yugoslavia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Macedonia, areas like that around there. So in the mid-1870s, Christian Slavs living in these Ottoman-controlled provinces of Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Bulgaria rebelled against their Muslim leaders. They were this new nationalist spirit that was sweeping across Europe, where the Germans had united. The French under Napoleon had become a lot less a bunch of small duchies and areas and became more French. The Italians had united. People began to say, hey, we're a nation too. And so what you get is a lot of people known as the Slavs who live in these areas, and they start believing they should be a nation. And this is called Pan-Slavism, that all Slavs, no matter what country they're in, should form one nation. Now, there is already one big nation that has a lot of Slavs in it, if you want to take any guess as to what that country is. Russia. So when the Pan-Slavic movement happens, Russia sees two distinct advantages. Number one, it gets a lot of natural resources. If it can get these peoples together, it gets seaports and warm water. Boy, a lot more land, a lot more power for them. And two, a lot more of a respect from other countries. So, inspired by this concept of Pan-Slavism, these Christian Slavs believe that all Slavic people should be autonomously united as one. And also moved by their Pan-Slavic dreams, other Slavs across the region joined the fight. Unfortunately, these people groups were no match for the Turkish army. The Turks dealt them a decisive defeat, and tens of thousands of Slavs were massacred. Now, seeing their fellow Slavs massacred and also seeing an opportunity to gain some more land, Russian forces descended on the Ottoman Empire. And after a very bloody campaign, the Russians, joined by the Romanians, defeated the Ottoman armies at the Siege of Pleven. This victory opened up the gateway for Russian forces to move further into Ottoman lands, seizing Adrianople in the year 1878. Seeing their hopes of victory dashed, the Ottoman Turks agreed to end the Russo-Turkish War with the Treaty of San Stefano. And this treaty, crippling the Ottoman Empire, saw Russia gain control of much of the Ottoman holdings in the Balkans. Adding great insult to injury, it also granted freedom from Ottoman rule to the Slavic regions of Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as independence to Romania. Unfortunately for Russia, the rest of Europe, especially Britain and Austria-Hungary, had no intention of letting Russia control the land delineated under the Treaty of San Stefano. Instead, the powerhouses of Europe stepped in with the Treaty of Berlin, in which Russia's winnings were greatly reduced. And this is going to irk and ire Russia, and it's one of the reasons Russia joins in at the beginning of World War I, as we'll see. So forced to accept this or perhaps face more fighting, Russia walked away with only new lands in the mountainous Caucasus regions. Bosnia and Herzegovina were given to Austria, while Romania was declared independent. And the effects of the Treaty of Berlin would be one of the leading proximate causes of World War I, like I said. So although the Treaty of Berlin wasn't great for Russia, it really devastated the Ottoman Empire. With much of their lands reallocated to other powers, the Ottoman Empire was reduced to not much more than a pawn in Europe's political game. They had no more power, and they were just being used as a chess piece, basically. So with its former glory draining away, the once mighty Ottoman Empire soon earned itself the nickname the sick man of Europe. Now, Russia's still looking for that warm water port. They're still looking for natural resources. They want to be imperialists too. And so with the South closed off to them for the rest of Europe, the West closed off to them by the rest of Europe, really the only place, and North is just all ice, by the way, the only place left to look is to the East. And unfortunately for Russia, they had to forfeit their great game with Britain in order to do this, because they got into a conflict over their expansion eastward with Japan. Now, trying to push their borders of their empire a bit too far, the Russians set their sights on Manchuria and Korea. Having no intentions of letting Russia have these areas, Japan attacked the Russian Navy in 1904. And this conflict lasted over a year and was known as the Russo-Japanese War. This war, the outcome of it, very bad for Russia, very good for Japan, because Japan comes into the world of westernized industrial nations with this, proving that they can field a formidable military force through technology. So it was significant because it saw Russians defeated and forced to give up its imperialist dreams in the Far East as well. So the end of the war was negotiated actually by US President Theodore Roosevelt, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize as a result of his work, one of only 2 of our presidents who've been awarded the Peace Prize. The Nobel Peace Prize was the brainchild of Alfred Nobel, who had invented dynamite and then felt so bad about inventing something that could kill so many people that he turned over his fortune he got from owning a rather successful company that produced cannons and armaments to fund an award every year to someone elected by a committee. So feeling guilty for the death and destruction his products caused, he took his profits at his death, established a foundation that would award people who progressed peace and scientific achievement. It's always struck me as somewhat odd that, it'd be like me killing somebody and then going, gosh, I just feel so bad killing this person. I'm going to award a scholarship every year to someone in their name. If I were the deceased, I'd rather be alive than that, in all honesty. So with the new imperialism sweeping the land and Japan proving, kind of filling its oats there, it decided to get in the imperialist game as well. And it started focusing on the Far East and China. But the problem was the West was already doing this as well, and China was feeling the impact. For instance, due to many unfair treaties, some parts of China saw Europeans immune from Chinese law. Therefore, they could not be tried in Chinese courts, which means Chinese citizens who were aggrieved had no recourse under the law. They basically became slaves of the law. And this caused abuses to occur all over and frequently. These unfair treaties also led to things like the mid-19th century Opium Wars. And as the name implies, the conflict saw Britain and China at war over the forced importation of opium into China. So what you have is out in Afghanistan, in that area, Pakistan, huge amounts of poppies grow. The only really thing you can get out of poppies is opiates. Great for painkillers and stuff, but very addictive. Well, if you want to sell a lot of that stuff and make these colonies out in the desert worth something, well, by gosh, you harvest this stuff and you push it into large populations who are very poor, don't have much going for them, that will, desire an escape. And hence you get the opium imports into China. And China was having a huge opium addiction crisis. Very similar to kind of what's going on with the opioid addiction crisis in the United States today, although I would say probably at a much larger, more intense scale. Sadly for the Chinese, the British were victorious in this short-lived war. However, China's headaches didn't end there. By the close of the 19th century, Germany, Russia, Japan, and even the United States had forced China into opening up their trade markets. In other words, they couldn't focus on building up Chinese industry to sell to the Chinese people because those were diluted by already established industries that were flooding the market with their goods at low cost. So as China's trade became dominated by outside forces, they lost sovereignty in areas like Port Arthur, the Shantung Peninsula, Manchuria, and most famously Hong Kong, which they were forced to lease. Hong Kong's like a New York. It's an island off the coast, but not too far off the coast. And they were forced to lease it to Great Britain for 100 years for an insanely low amount. So basically Hong Kong was a British colony. By the year 1900, tensions in China had hit the boiling point, and this is plainly seen in the Boxer Rebellion, in which Chinese nationalists murdered thousands of foreigners in an effort to rid their land of outside influence. Although many foreign lives were lost, the conflict saw the same end as the Opium Wars. Not surprisingly, the nationalists were subdued by European forces, and China's ruling dynasty was further weakened. Again, new imperialism seemed to win the day.